seem to be lots of other authors. So when I was asked to do this, the first question I had was, wait a minute, I wrote a book about the Bible. It's not a story. They were okay with that. So my book is really about the story of Genesis. So what I wanted to do was, when people look at Genesis, they look at pieces. They look at all the big stories. But back in 2012, 2013, when I read the whole book, all 50 chapters, there was so much more stuff in there than anybody ever looks at, talks about. You won't hear most of the stuff when you go to church. Chances are, if you go to temple, you're not going to hear a whole lot of this stuff either. So I wanted to talk about everything, all 50 chapters. And when I read, there were so many things that were interesting. For starters, it's inspiring because pretty much all the people in Genesis, and there's a lot of them, men and women, a lot of women in Genesis, they're all doing very human things. They're not getting along. They're having sex all the time, incidentally. They're trying to get along. They're going through generations and generations. And what I was looking at was, do these generations stay with God, or do they move away from God? And that's, frankly, that's the biggest storyline in the whole Bible. The whole Bible is about, can people hold on to this basic relationship with the one true God of all creation? And Genesis starts at Adam. Adam's the first person that has it. So when I started the book, when I was reading Genesis, I got excited. And one of the things I kept coming to was certain principles that were going on throughout the book. So the first chapter of Genesis, the 12 things you need to know when reading Genesis. All these years when I was thinking about it, I thought there was only 10, but I'd never written them down. When I actually wrote them down, there was 12 of them. They're general principles about what's going on, because they seem so obvious. So some of them are like, all the men in Genesis are bent. They're all flawed. There's nobody that's living a very sacred, very moral life. Oh, by the way, the women aren't any better. What's one of the interesting things you see in Genesis, that women, even though it's a patriarchal society, find a way to affect the story. Let's see, what else do we have in Genesis? One of the things I think is important in Genesis is that Genesis is at the cusp of history and prehistory. It starts out, one of the arguments I make is that I argue that Adam is the first historical man. So there may have been other people before Genesis, but we don't have a record of them. We don't have a record of their name. For practical purposes, the story of mankind starts with how we can record it, how we can understand it. And Adam, at least as far as the Bible is concerned, is the first person, has a name. And, oh, by the way, just as important, he's the first person that has a personal relationship, what we know of as God, one true God of all creation. Again, other people might have had it, but we don't have a record of it. So Genesis happens at the cusp of history and prehistory. Another big point of writing the book was there's all these stories, all these really interesting and in cases important stories that are in Genesis that nobody knows about. And so I wanted to write about them. I wanted to look at them. I wanted to analyze them. So part of the writing of the book was to put in all of that as part of, put it on the table as part of what we can get out of Genesis. Now, so I had never had any idea of writing a book. I'd never written a book before. Hadn't had any plans to, but from the time I reread Genesis back in 2012, 2013, I couldn't get it out of my head. I had all these ideas about what was going on, all these things that I kept telling people about, all the 10 things you need to know when reading it. I started reading other things, but Genesis wouldn't leave me alone. I'd think about it late at night. I'd be up till 4 a.m. thinking about, oh, gee, what about this other thing I want to write about? What about this? In May of 2021, I've been doing this for so many years. Once again, couldn't get to sleep. So when I got up the next morning, I said, okay, that's it. I'm writing down this book that's been in my head all this time. So this was June of 2021. Took me a while to figure out what the system would be, what process would I use. But once I got started, it moved along. And so what happened was by November of 2021, I'd written the entire book. The book is in two parts. The first part is the 12 things you need to know about Genesis, the creation and the patriarchs through Abraham. And the second part is Jacob and his family. And those, the first part is 11 chapters, and the second part is 11 chapters, 22 chapters, which is interesting because there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, so it has a kind of symmetry that I liked. And again, it covers the entire 50 chapters of Genesis. One of the things I did, in addition to just simply following the story in the Bible, I found other sources that travel across the whole 50 chapters exactly in the same sequence as the Bible does. One of them is Jewish Midrash. I was able to go to a Jewish bookstore and find one book that covers the whole 50 chapters of Genesis. Midrash gives you an oral tradition of the events of Genesis. What's nice is it adds details that you don't find in the written Genesis book and tradition. It also has other things. Midrash takes the story and it then plays with it, asks questions about it. It'll treat it almost like Aesop's fables. They'll have situations that use the ideas to teach principles. I wasn't really interested in using those, but a lot of the details that come in about what's happening added flavor, added specific details to the story that I thought were relevant. The other big source is Josephus, Flavius Josephus's Antiquities. Josephus lived around the time of the destruction of the temple in, I think it's 86. He was living in Rome and wrote a history of the Jews for the purpose of his Roman audience. But what Josephus does, he takes the entire book of Genesis chapter by chapter, but he's closer to the events. And so he adds a lot of details, again, similar to the Midrash. The other things I added, one of the things I do in the book is one of the big reasons for writing the book is all the major religions treat Abraham as a principal patriarch for all their religions. So I knew that going into reading the book, but there's more specific details about Abraham and how he lives with his neighbors that were really important and, to my mind, added to the greatness of Abraham. And all of them have to do with the fact that when we first meet Abraham, he's leaving the place he's lived his life in Mesopotamia. He lived in Ur, and then he lived in Haran. At 75, he leaves and never goes back. He lives the next 100 years in Canaan, an area that he has no family there. He's an alien. He lives the entire history of Genesis that we see as an alien. And yet he finds a way to live in peace with his neighbors. He spends some time in Egypt. He spends a lot of time in Canaan, in different places in Canaan. And we meet some of those people specifically in Genesis. and there are conflicts that happen, but he always lives in peace. He always finds a way to get along with his neighbors. And I found that inspiring, because here we are, October 7th, we have Hamas crashing into Israel, massacring people, taking prisoners, taking hostages. Here we go again. These people are at war with each other. They're fighting each other. It's always been that way. It was that way in Judges, where they're fighting each other. Time of David, they're fighting each other. People have been saying forever, there can be no peace in the Middle East because there's never been peace. I say to them, you need to read Genesis, because in Genesis, Abraham shows us how to live in peace, and he shows us specifically. It's almost like a handbook on how to live with your neighbors. There's a number of places where he has situations come up. What he does is he always when he tries to make a deal, he doesn't care if he gets the low end of the deal. He's concerned about the relationship. He's always concerned about the relationship. So matter how he makes it, matter what he does. Let's see. Oh, Donald Rosenbaum. Yes, that's right. That's correct. Yeah, but what's interesting is there's all these different stories that nobody hears about that show you specifically how he gets along with people. For instance, his wife dies. He needs to bury her. So throughout the entire book, nobody in that family owns property. He doesn't own property. Jacob buys some property in Shechem, but otherwise he doesn't own any property. Joseph becomes the most powerful man in Egypt. So he's certainly taken care of. But all these people, as they travel through Genesis, they don't own any property. They don't stand over anybody. So Abraham has to bury his wife. So he goes to the local people, sits down at the gate of the city, and he negotiates to buy a field and a cave to bury his wife. So he's got in mind where he wants to bury her. So he says to the people, I would like to buy your cave and the field. They say, oh, Abraham, we know you. You're a great man. What is it to us? Just, you can have the field. Abraham says, no, I want to buy it. I want to do it fair and square. The guy gives him a price, which in the commentary says was ridiculously high. Abraham, instead of arguing him down, he says, yes, I'll buy it. And he pays him right then and there before all his witnesses. He buys the field. And so he leaves things such that he doesn't take advantage of them. He's scrupulously honest. Oh, good question. Quiet, curious. Well, the thing is, for starters, my book talks about everything. It doesn't just talk about the big things. And I analyze all the things that are going on. For instance, I'll give you an example. There's timelines between Adam and Noah, Noah to Abraham. Everybody agrees these timelines are ridiculous. Adam, he lives, 962 years. All these other patriarchs live 900 years. Noah lives to be 950. So in my book, I say, well, I agree with you. They're crazy. Well, for the sake of argument, let's argue that they're accurate. If we consider that they're accurate, what can we deduce from this? Well, one of the things is they're all really specific. They don't look like rounded off numbers, and they're all in the same general category. So when you talk about people today, they live to be 70, they live to be 80. They're all in the same general area. Well, all these ages are all in the same general area. The other thing I argue is that you get to Noah, it's 950. When you get to Shem, it's 600. After that, people don't live so long. They live to be 200. By the time you get to Terah, he only lives to be 110, Terah lives to be, I think, 206. When we get to Abraham, he lives to be 175. Terah's father, Nahor, doesn't live long at all. I think he lives to be 120. We get to Isaac, who lives 180. Jacob lives to be 146. We get down to Joseph. He's down to 110. So one of the things I argue in the book is, well, what happened? What happened? Well, what happened is the flood. Noah is 600 when the flood happens. He lives to be 950. But after the flood, people don't live so long. So it would seem to argue that before the flood, people, for whatever reason, were able to live a longer life. After the flood, not so much. Something happened after the flood. So again, I'm not actually arguing, sure. I'm just saying, for the sake of consideration, that's something worth at least making the argument for. Oh, good, Jennifer. Thank you. So there's a lot of analysis like that, where if you look at the book closely and take it seriously, because there's a lot of detail. That's one of the 12 things. Genesis is very specific. For instance, one of the things that's interesting is you can make a lot of surmises about how old people are because Genesis keeps telling you how old they are. I'll give you an example. Genesis tells us that when, oh my goodness, you should read, well, in further sessions, I'm going to bring up some of these stories nobody's ever heard of because they're so interesting, particularly about Abraham, but there's more in there. So Genesis tells us that when Joseph finally gets raised to be the most powerful man in Egypt other than the Pharaoh, he's 30 years old. Genesis tells us that Joseph has predicted there'll be 7 years of great crops. Genesis says they stopped counting. There was so much stuff, so much grain, they stopped counting it. There was so much. The next 7 years, famine. So it happened just the way Joseph predicted. 7 years, and so he's collecting all of it because he knows they're going to need it. Now there's a year of famine. Now the Bible tells us there was famine in Canaan. Jacob says, "Oh my God, we're going to perish. You sons, get over to Egypt. I hear they got food." So he sends them over. Joseph gives them a hard time, but he gives them stuff, gives them things to bring back. But famine continues. The second year, he sends them back. But Joseph, he plays a game. He gives them his brothers who don't recognize him a hard time. He holds on to Reuben, or is it Simeon? I think he held on to Simeon. Sends them back. He makes them bring, when they come back, all the brothers have to bring Benjamin. He didn't come back last time. So to make the story shorter, at the second year of famine, he shows himself that he's Joseph. He invites them to come live with him. And the Pharaoh also invites them. So they all come. So Jacob comes and he has an interview with the Pharaoh. He says, I've been on this earth 130 years and my time has been hard and not pleasant. So Genesis tells us that when Jacob comes to live in Egypt, he's 130. Well, we already know that Joseph was 30 when he was raised up. And so he's had 7 years of plenty and 2 years of famine. So now he's 39. So we can deduce from that Jacob must have been 91 when he and Rachel had Joseph. Again, I think it's not just, oh, Steve, where'd you find that? I mean, if you read the book closely, you can come up with some of these things. So anyway, that's an example of the kinds of arguments you can make because there's so much specific information found in Genesis. And I had been thinking about it forever, and I finally just wrote it all down. So I have time. So one of the things I did when I looked at the timelines, I thought, let's make a timeline. One of the things you make timelines, you realize that, for instance, Adam lives like 8 generations into the future. So for those future generations, Adam's not just a person they've heard about. He's actually there. He lives well into all these future generations. Noah lives almost to the time of Abraham. Now, one of the things I argue in the book is that most people think that Abraham was born when Terah, his father, was 70. But what Genesis says, it says after Terah turned 70, he had 3 sons. He had Haran, Nahor, and Abraham. But I argue that actually, I think Terah was 130 when he had Abraham. So that leads you to some other conclusions. One of which is, if Terah was 70 when Abraham was born, Noah is still alive, which is crazy. But he lived 950 years. But I argue that that Terah was 130 for a variety of reasons. I argue that. At which point Noah has only recently died. So for instance, again, because Genesis is so specific, Abraham is 100 when he has Isaac. Isaac is 40 when he gets married. So that means Abraham's 140. Isaac has the twins, Esau and Jacob, when he's 60. When he is 60, he has the 2 children. That means that Abraham was 160. So one of the things we can realize is that for the first 15 years of Jacob and Esau's life, Abraham was still around. He was still alive. He wasn't just someone they heard about. There was somebody they saw, they heard his voice, they experienced him. And I like to emphasize that both Esau and Jacob, particularly Jacob, that influence never left them. And we see all the misadventures Jacob has in Genesis. He never loses his one God appreciation. He always, every time he's in trouble, he will look to God and God looks to him. That never goes away. And I think that's partly because he lives long enough to actually personally know his grandfather, Abraham. How are we doing here? We still got time? Let me see what the time here is, people. 12:30. Oh my God. Anyway, so that's a beginning look at what I'm up to. It's a book that's over 300 pages. You can buy it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. You can also buy it through Zulon, the publisher. I made some further revisions with Zulon that I think if you get it through Zulon, they have the revisions. I got an ebook from Amazon that doesn't include the revisions, but the revisions are mostly small. Incidentally, if you go to Amazon and look at the ebook, you can read parts of the book before you buy it. You can actually read parts of the book, because if you're not interested in the Bible or reading about the Bible, you probably wouldn't be interested in this book. But you can read on Amazon at the ebook. You can read parts of it. I would recommend reading the preface, which talks about who I am and why I wrote the book, and some of the things, some of the ideas I put in. Like, for instance, I didn't want to write it in the first person, so I used the first person plural, we. We is not an authorial. We is not an authorial. We. I'm thinking of me and the reader. My hope is the reader is coming along with me on this exploration of Genesis. As I write in the book, I hope the reader will agree with me, though I don't expect the reader to always agree with me. But together, we're going to look through Genesis, all the stuff going on in Genesis. Another thing I did, I started out writing the book in the past tense, but in the end, the present tense won out. It just works better in the present tense. In fact, when I went back to revise the book, I had the earlier parts of it were in the past tense, but by about the third of the book, the present tense had won. So I had to go back and put everything in the present tense because I write the book like an adventure story. Yeah, well, I hope so. And yeah, I think I like to tell people it's not a commentary. It's more like an autopsy. So I cut open every chapter. I take out the parts. I look at them. I weigh them. They measure them. And then I analyze them. What can we draw? What conclusions can we draw? And there's a lot of conclusions you can draw because Genesis is so specific. But again, if you go to Amazon, you can read parts of the early chapters to get a sense of what the book is like. So anyway, do I still have time? Will I get cut off? Anyway, I'll keep talking as long as I still have a view here. Let's see. So yes, it's a paperback, $19.99. You can buy as an ebook for $9.99. I tried it out. It works good. And one of the things, I use 450 citations because I quote, I quote in Jewish Midrash. I quote Josephus' Antiquities quite a bit. I also, in early chapters I have a chapter on the prequel for Abraham because the Bible doesn't tell us anything about Abraham and Ur, but some of these other sources do. And I wanted to put those in because a lot of them have the same story. And in part of that story, I was able to find some really good archaeological information on what Ur looked like and what Canaan looked like. And I think it's fascinating. Ur was a very civilized city. The typical house was several stories. But when you got to Canaan, places were small, tense, or not very organized. And so in looking at this, you realize what Abraham gave up. He gave up a much more civilized place in Ur and Haran to go to this desolate place in Canaan. Incidentally, I'm really proud of the covers on this book, the front and back covers. The ones that Zulon had submitted, I thought were hokey and not very interesting. What I was looking for in the cover was desolation, because that's when people went to Canaan. It's it's a beautiful but a very desolate looking place. And so Zulon has a deal with Shutterstock. So I went to Shutterstock. If you put in Genesis, they got really hokey, not very interesting cover or pictures to represent it. But if you go to Canaanite desert, that's where I found the pictures on the front and back covers. I wanted desolation. This is what Abraham was looking at and going into when he left Haran and went to Canaan, much different territory. Yes, there's a lot of citations. That's right. And that took a lot of my time writing the book. I had a lot of trouble getting them in, but I really wanted to have them because, I draw a lot of information from these sources. I want to make sure that they were cited. And so I cite all of them. I even use a couple other Bibles because once in a while, they had an interpretation that better clarified what was going on. So in a couple of cases, I actually drew on some other Bibles. Mostly used the NIV. That's my favorite, the NIV. A lot of citations, yes. Well, let me tell you about citations. What I wanted to do was go from 1 to 73, 1 to whatever the citation at the end of chapter 1. Start at 1 again and 2. Start at 1 again, 3. Took me forever to figure out how to do it on Office Word. I finally stumbled into it. But when I sent it to Zooline, they just did 1 to the end. So instead of 1 to each chapter, it's 1 to 450. I have 450 citations. But I really wanted to. We have 5 more minutes. Still 1 more minute. Yeah, 1 more minute. Okay, well, that's pretty much it. I will be talking further about the book throughout the festival, so feel free to jump in and even if you don't buy the book, you can look at it on Amazon, and feel free to look at some of the stuff. And if you want to ask me about it, feel free. Yeah, a lot of citations, yes, sirree. But they were important because I wanted people to know where some of these observations came from. I have 1 minute. I think my 1 minute's up. Well, I want to thank Reader's Magnet for giving me the chance to talk about, in the beginning, a consideration of Genesis.